folks. Thank you all for coming to the workshop, Radical Mental Health, the Liberation Health Model of Social Work Practice, which is part of the weekend-long inaugural international conference hosted by the International Social Work Action Network. For those of you that are just joining our conference today, the International Social Work Action Network, formed in 2009, is a network of radical social work organizations and supporters from across the globe. What unites the Swan Eye groups is our commitment to political action and campaign work to improve social work practice for the benefit of all those involved in, participating in, receiving, or providing social work services. We support fully funded social work, health, and welfare services free at the point of use and delivery. My name is Amy Takanami. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm currently the Policy and Community Organizing Director at Zero Debt, Massachusetts, based in the US. And I'm also a steering committee member of the Boston Liberation Health Group, a group of over 2,000 people all over the world who are interested in applying a socio-political method to social work practice. Before we start, I have a few Zoom suggestions to share for you all. 1, please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. Any background noise can be distracting, especially for those who are not native English speakers. 2, we will be recording this session and it will be posted to Swan's YouTube page after the presentation. If you aren't comfortable being recorded, please turn your camera off. 3, feel free to post any questions you have in the chat throughout the presentation, which I will try to keep track of and monitor. However, we're going to have a designated Q&A at the end of our conversation today, so if you can, please wait to post your questions until then. 4, if you set your Zoom on speaker view versus gallery view at the top right corner of your Zoom screen, you will be able to see the full screen of presenters. And finally, if you know of anyone that was unable to access the Zoom meeting today, we're also live streaming on Facebook, so feel free to refer folks to the Boston Liberation Health Facebook page. So this workshop is going to dive into the Liberation Health framework and model, which is a socio-political method of challenging oppressive, dominant worldview messages and institutions that affect our lives. I'm going to begin by introducing our co-presenters for this session, who will be walking us through the framework and model. Dawn Belkin-Martinez is the Associate Dean for Equity and Inclusion and a Clinical Associate Professor at Boston University School of Social Work in the US. She's the co-author of the book, Social Justice in Clinical Practice, a Liberation Health Frame for Social Work, and is one of the founding members of the Boston Liberation Health Group. Welcome, Dawn. And Mahale is obtaining her master's in public health at George Washington University in Washington, DC. She received her master's of social work in 2019 from Boston University, where she specialized in child trauma and social work leadership. Her clinical practice is focused on decolonizing mental health treatment and addressing how oppressive structural and cultural factors impact mental health and wellness through a public health lens. She is also a steering committee member of the Boston Liberation Health Group. Welcome, Mahale. So I'm going to direct my first question on the Liberation Health model to Dawn. Dawn, can you talk about how the Liberation Health model was developed?
Sure, and welcome everybody from Boston to the United States to all over the world. We're so excited to see you here. So the story about Boston Liberation Health is very interesting. It actually started in a hospital, a very traditional hospital, one of the Harvard teaching hospitals here in Boston. And there were a group of people working in the psychiatry department that were wanting to figure out a different way to do mental health care, because so much of it was about, blaming individuals for their own individual problem. And at the same time, the hospital conducted a pretty large consumer satisfaction survey. And one of the things that they discovered was our department, which was psychiatry, had the lowest consumer satisfaction scores out of any place in the hospital. And the parents were very unhappy. The parents were sort of telling us that they didn't feel like they were respected, that they didn't feel that people listened to them, that they felt like they were judged, all sorts of things. And as a result of that, the director of the unit, who was a pretty traditional psychiatrist trained psychoanalytically, came to us and said, you know what, maybe we need to think of a different way to engage parents. Maybe we need to think of a way to connect with people so they don't feel so blamed. So at that point, a bunch of us went down to Brazil and studied with some people from the Paulo Freire Institute in Porto Alegre. And we learned a lot about the Freire model and sort of, alternative ways to think about mental health. And then we came back to the United States. And then working in the hospital, one of the things that we found was that people had their own ideas, because we couldn't take what was done in Brazil and sort of, transform it completely and translate it to Boston. So we needed to really work with the people that were the most directly impacted by, the services, right? The families that we were working with. And so with those families, with the families leading the way, right, we developed this new model, which is a socio-political frame of reflecting on mental health care and all of the external factors that are impacting our own health. And that became known as the Liberation Health Model. And that was 20 years ago. And here we are today.
Thank you so much, Dawn. So my next question is to Mahale. How might you explain the Liberation Health model to a colleague in 30 seconds or less in kind of like an elevator pitch?
Yes, that's a great question. So we all joke in Liberation Health that the triangle solves all ills. There's an emoji that is a yellow triangle with an exclamation point. I've officially made that the Liberation Health emoji. So basically the Liberation Health model is a way of looking at a specific problem and seeing how other factors play a role in that problem. So what are the cultural factors that play a role in that problem? What are the institutional ways of, or institutional factors that play a role in that problem? And then taking a step back to look at the larger picture and then create an action plan to move forward. And the great thing about this model is that you can use it with youth as young as 5 and anyone as old as 102.
Thanks, Mahale. So let's start to dive in a little bit deeper. So my next question is to Dawn. The Liberation Health model draws from 5 conceptual frameworks. Can you talk a little bit more about each theoretical framework?
Sure. So the first one, as I mentioned earlier, is Paulo Freire in popular education. And to briefly summarize Freire's work, his ideas are that the people that are the most directly impacted by the oppression are the ones that should be sort of leading and teaching, right? Us. Sort of, he talked about learning and education as a dialogical process, right? So that traditional mental health often is sort of us sort of coming up with our own ideas and acting upon other people. And Freire's ideas are that it's a circular kind of recursive process so that we sort of learn from the people that we are working with and they sort of help us. That's the first theory. The second theory that we sort of draw from is the work of Ignacio Martin Baró and liberation psychology. And I really appreciate this theory so much because what Martin Baró said was that there are many problems with traditional psychology, and those being that it was about getting people to adapt to oppression. It was really about sort of people having problems and figuring out a way to sort of be in the world that required them adapting to whatever injustice that they were experiencing. And he said psychology has to be more than that. It has to be not only that people have to adapt to the environment that they're in, but the environment that they're in needs to change really significantly, right? So that there's we act on the world as well as the world acting upon us. The third theory that I'd like to sort of summarize real briefly is the work of Bertha Capon Reynolds and the rank and file movement in social work. So we have social work has a very, I would say, mixed history, very mixed history in terms of, being on the side of the oppressor versus the oppressed. And Bertha Capon Reynolds was somebody that started out as an analyst at Smith, very traditional. And she went to work in communities. And what she found was that, the conditions that people were experiencing and having to interact with were oppressing them, right? It wasn't, there wasn't really anything wrong with the person, but that, you know, these conditions were really oppressive and they needed to be changed. So she became involved in a movement in the United States in the 1930s called the rank and file movement. And that movement was all about social workers getting out, talking to people, organizing, and trying to change systems. She was a Marxist. She was eventually blacklisted from Smith and could not get another social work job in her career. Ironically, Smith, you know, after she died, sort of founded a scholarship for her. So that's the third theory. The fourth theory, which is pretty important, is the work of Antonio Gramsci. And I will not attempt to sort of summarize Gramsci, you know, for you extensively, other than to say he talked a lot about the ideas of worldview, right? And for liberation health social workers, the concept of worldview is seminal. How do people get to think the way they do? What are the dominant worldviews? And I'll talk a little bit about that later, because understanding those worldviews means that we can start to take them apart. And then the fourth theory, the fifth theory that we draw from is intersectionality and the Combahee River collective statement, right? You know, people think of that term as a recent term. It's actually pretty old. It's from the 70s, Black women. And the idea is that we are many different identities and we need to sort of understand how all those identities intersect and interact with one another, class, race, gender, things like that.
Thanks so much, Dawn. So aside from these RAD theoretical frameworks, what are the core concepts one needs to understand related to liberation health theory?
So there are, I would say, four basic core concepts as a radical mental health you know, clinician that you need to know. And the first one is understanding what the historical moment is, like what's happening right now in your space, in your time, right? So here I am, I'm in Boston, 2021 in March. The historical moment here, right, is very different than it might be, I don't know, in Antarctica, you know, 10 years ago or, you know, or right now. So understanding your historical moment and being able to sort of really get what the current conjuncture is vital, right? The second most important concept, and this is crucial, is the concept of worldview that I mentioned from Antonio Gramsci, right? Everything that we understand about the world, all ideas, how we make sense of who we are, what we think of ourselves, what we think of other people, is all related to worldview, right? But not all worldviews are equal, right? So there's what we call a dominant worldview. And the dominant worldview are the ideas from the ideas and the kind of common knowledge that the people that have the power want you to believe, right? So when I went to school, for example, which, I mean, I'm older, but I'm not that old, right? So when I went to school, the dominant worldview around being queer was that it was a mental health illness, for example. So when I went to graduate school, my MSW program, the DSM had ego-dystonic homosexuality as an Axis 1 diagnosis. So that was the dominant worldview. However, that worldview was deconstructed and changed, right? Through activism, through organizing, through the people's movement, right? And that no longer was the case when I graduated. So understanding worldview is really important because it's a key component of what a liberation health social worker does, right? And what we say is that when people have experienced a lot of oppression, you know, from the dominant worldview, because of their race, because of their class, because of individualism, because of professionalism, because of elitism, all these dominant worldview ideas, they're more likely to feel like the world acts upon them, right? So Paulo Freire has 200 pages about this, and he calls it objects and subjects. And objects, he says, are people that feel like the world acts upon them because of oppression. Mm-hmm. So for liberation health practitioners, understanding how people experience life, either as an object or subject, right, is really important. And what Ferry says is the more oppression you've experienced, the more likely it is that you'll feel like the world acts upon you. Right? And then finally, the last component of that is the concept of liberation and transformation. So the work of a liberation health social worker, and my comrade is going to talk about this in a little bit, is to deconstruct dominant worldviews. So not only do we want to change the outside world, right, and sort of changing the way that systems run, we also want to change the way we think. We want to change what Ferry liked to call the cop in your head, right? The cop in your head that has internalized the dominant worldviews and is sort of making you think you're less than, or impacting your self-concept, self-esteem. So, with that transformation comes liberation.
Thanks, Dawn. So now that we have a better understanding of the theory underlying the model, Mahale, I'm wondering if you can walk us through the actual tangible components of a liberation health model.
Okay, so there are 4 steps, not 111, to the liberation health method. So the first step is to define the problem, see it in its totality, analyze the personal, cultural, and institutional factors that are contributing to the problem in the center, and deconstruct those dominant worldview messages. Then it's to rescue the historical memory of change and then develop an action plan. And we will go through a case where we break down each step. So before we get started on doing the Liberation Health Triangle, it's important to practice the Liberation Health Triangle in a trauma-informed lens. So what that means is I'm going to do a very brief overview of trauma and neurobiology. So I've talked to a lot of colleagues who've done the Liberation Health Triangle with clients, and they're like, I don't know where it went wrong, like it didn't go well. And one of them was that their client was dysregulated at that moment, or triggered or dissociating. That is not the time to do a Liberation Health Triangle. This is a very cerebral activity. And so you do need to be present in order to look at those different factors and retain that information. So here I have a picture of a brain. I had a professor give us an example of using your hand, fist, as an example of a brain. So if this is your frontal lobe right here, and then this is your brain stem, whenever someone is triggered, their frontal lobe goes off. And so you use the reptilian part of your brain, well, right here, and that's your fight, flight, freeze. So like I said, that is not the time to do a Liberation Health Triangle. And so it's important to be attuned to your client, or even if you're doing it with yourself, a friend, that they're in the right headspace. And then on top of that, making sure that the Liberation Health Triangle is not done in an oppressive manner. So my favorite quote is, if your only tool is a hammer, everything's gonna look like a nail. And so when doing the Liberation Health model, it's important to talk about these different factors in a developmentally appropriate manner, using their language. We can go in with a client and be like, well, this is a result of cis hetero white, whatever. And they're going to be like, what? So using their language and then providing the vocabulary to connect what they've experienced, and having words for it, because that is powerful. So now we're going to talk about the details of the triangle. So first, we're going to define the problem. And it's important when defining the problem that it's not specifically an individual. Like, for example, in family therapy, there might be an individual in the family who's scapegoated, and they'll say like, oh, that person's the problem. They're the ones who don't listen, blah, blah, blah. They should not be the problem statement. The problem is a succinct way of describing what is happening. And we'll talk more about that when we do our case example. So next, we're going to go through the personal factors. So this is all the individual characteristics in regards to that person. So that will be the developmental history, that could be trauma, that could be a disability, conflict impacting the family, etc. And that goes on the top of the triangle here. So then next are the cultural factors. So that goes right here in the bottom right-hand side of the triangle. And these are messages around race, gender, class, individualism, capitalism, etc. And again, it's important when listing these cultural factors that we use the language that our clients are using, and then provide the vocabulary and do that psycho-ed of what those fancy words are. So the next is institutional factors. So when I'm working with my clients who are youth, I tend to describe it as things that are tangible or like a building. There's some that don't fall under that, like capitalism. You can't really touch capitalism. But that would include healthcare system, education system, carceral state, etc. I had a client talking about body image, and she actually included gyms, which was something I never thought about, and an institutional factor that can impact someone's body image and anxiety about going into a gym. And then the most important part is rescuing that historical memory of change. And so explaining that once you look at the full triangle, talking about how that this person is not alone. Their struggle is connected to struggles across the globe, across time. Going back to my colleagues who have done the Liberation Health Triangle and have really struggled. Oftentimes they forget this part, and if this part is not included, people can feel really discouraged, being like, oh damn, like white supremacy is really ruining my life, like I don't know what to do. And that's why this rescue of historical memory is so key. So now we're going to go through a case example. So Aisha is a Black 28-year-old cis female, not trans, Muslim residing in Boston, Massachusetts, USA. Aisha lives with her father, who is 53, her brother, who's 32, her sister, 19, and grandmother, who's 74, in a 3-bedroom apartment. Aisha is a frontline worker at a grocery store. Her job has not provided PPE for employees and have doubled employee hours due to many calling out sick with COVID-19. Aisha has reported difficulty falling asleep and described feelings of tightness in her chest since COVID-19 began. She is the primary caretaker of her father and grandmother, which has exacerbated her stress levels. Aisha's strengths are that she is very resourceful, thoughtful of others, self-reflective, and trilingual. So this is an example of the Liberation Health Triangle. We'll provide a link to a Google Drive later so you can access this template. But of course, you can always draw it on a scrap piece of paper. So here we have our personal factors, cultural, institutional, and a spot to put our action steps. So when I was talking with Aisha, she mentioned feeling overwhelmed, feeling that she was isolated, feeling like she couldn't breathe. And, you know, she, at a certain point, she was like, you know, it feels like I'm drowning without a life jacket. And I was like, yeah, like it really does sound like that. And maybe that's something we can put as the problem statement. And she was like, yeah, I feel like that really encapsulates what I'm really dealing with. So, whoops. So we put that as our problem statement. So next we went through personal factors. So it was just basically things that were pertinent to her. So she's 28 years old, she's Muslim, she lives in Boston, she's a frontline worker, she has difficulty sleeping, she's experienced chest tightness, and she plays a caretaking role in her family. So then we went to the cultural factors. So can I skip one? So one factor is cis heteropatriarchy. So the fact that she is not the oldest in her family, but the oldest female, and all of the caretaking responsibilities rely on her. And oftentimes that is the case across the globe. There was an article I saw recently where it said that moms during COVID have taken the brunt of caretaking in families, and obviously like hetero relationship, but femmes tend to do the brunt work of emotional labor and caretaking, and that is not fair and due to dominant worldview messaging that men or male presenting individuals don't do care work. Then we talked about white supremacy. So she gave an example about how she was concerned about her dad getting COVID and wanting him to get tested, but the local community health clinic didn't have interpreters who spoke Somali or Arabic. And so she would have to take off work to take him there. And she had already taken off multiple days of work in order to care for her grandmother and was concerned about losing her job. Then there's individualism. So it's this idea that you're going to pull yourself from your bootstraps, like it's solely your responsibility to deal with your problems, and you alone. There are no external factors that contribute to what you're dealing with. And she touched upon that in feeling really alone. Again, the caretaking role in regards to the patriarchy, and then the cultural message that workers are disposable, so that companies are not providing PPE, companies being like, well, if you get COVID, you get COVID, sorry. And oftentimes when people recover but are still experiencing symptoms of fatigue, they're companies that have fired employees because they couldn't come back and do like a 40-hour week. Then we have institutional factors, so that includes capitalism tying into workers are disposable, the medical industrial complex, so in regards to not being able to get good care for those who are non-English speakers, and then US imperialism and colonization. So oftentimes, so when immigrants come here, it's because the US has been there. And so people are trying to escape and hope to, achieve the American dream because of the impact colonization has had on their countries. And that includes Somalia. And then and one last one is the public health response. So the US has done a terrible job of their response to COVID, and it has been very state specific and oftentimes company specific. And as a result, there has been a lot of siloing of interventions and not a lot of consistency. So then we talked about what was it like to look at this triangle and see, that she is drowning without a life jacket, but there's a reason why. It's not just her. It's not her fault for having trouble sleeping. It's not her fault that she has tightness in her chest. It's all of these other factors. And talking about how she is not alone. There are frontline workers all over the world who are experiencing this, and that things need to change and things can be done. So the action steps we talked about was having a discussion with her family about gender roles and expectations of her caretaking. Like, can her older brother take on some roles? Can her younger sister take on some roles? And connecting that with community care. Are there people in the community who can take him to get tested for COVID? Are there times when people in the community can bring food to the hospital if anyone is sick? And so that it's tying to that individualism piece where she doesn't feel responsible for everything. And then organizing at work. So talking to people at work, being like, hey, like, you don't have PPE, you know, we're sewing makeshift masks at home, and this is not okay. We shouldn't, you know, be concerned about dying from COVID. And what can we do to get management's attention to change things? Does that mean creating a union? Does that mean, you know, pushing back on middle management, writing letters, etc.?
Thank you so much, Mahalet, for walking us through that case example. Hopefully that helps folks in the room better conceptualize how you might use this model in your own practice. So my next question is going to be for Dawn. Now that we have this broad and holistic understanding of a client's problem using the Liberation Health Triangle, what do Liberation Health interventions look like? How do you address the personal, the cultural, and institutional factors? What are the 4 major Liberation Health interventions? And Dawn, I think you're muted.
Great question, and I unmuted myself. So the first step in all of this, after I always think of the triangle as the assessment. So that's the assessment piece that I do that with everybody that I work with. You know, that's usually done the second, third, fourth session that I meet with people. Once we start working on the interventions, which I will say are not standalone, you can use them with other different kinds of, you know, mental health interventions. The first step is to sort of recognize and, you know, identify dominant worldview messages. So what is there a dominant worldview message here? So I was talking to somebody the other day and she was telling me she felt like, you know, a failure, right? She was saying she felt like a failure. And I sort of asked her more about that. And the reason was that she was really behind at work, right? So she was super behind at work and she couldn't get all of her cases written up and she was behind in her paperwork and things like that. So we talked about the idea of like, well, how does being a failure and being, you know, behind at work relate? And she sort of mentioned that she feels like she's like less of a person if she can't keep up with the work. So we identified a dominant worldview message about production, right? Like you are what you produce. And then if you aren't producing a lot, you're less than. So the next thing that we do is deconstruct the message, right? So we take that message apart. So that's sort of addressing the cop in your head, right? So we started to talk about production, who benefits when you're producing and working so much and you're working all these extra hours. And it turned out she was working about like 10 to 15 extra hours a week, right? And somehow she was feeling bad about herself because she was working all these extra hours that she wasn't compensated for. She couldn't get her work done. So we take that message apart, like, are you who you are? Who you are, is that really dependent on what you produce and how many records you get written up and things like that? So we take that message apart, we deconstruct it. And then the next thing, the next step is introducing new information. And the way we introduce new information is we ask people about different ideas. So like, what would it be like, right? If you didn't have to, you know, do all this extra work? What would it be like if you didn't have a caseload that was, you know, undoable? And we talk about different examples. We talked about social work caseloads in New Zealand because they are much lower than they are here. And then finally, I wanted to sort of, our last step is rescuing the historical memory of change, right? And so Mahalet mentioned that earlier, right? We talk about people fighting back, right? And I gave the example of people fighting back about calling being queer, you know, a diagnosis. It didn't just change because the psychiatrist thought, oh, the DSM is too heavy and we have to have less illnesses in it. We're going to decrease the number of illnesses. No, it changed because people fought back and challenged dominant worldviews and pushed, right? And we do that all the time. And any social change that we have in this country is a result of people pushing back and challenging the dominant worldview and talking about those stories. So rescuing the historical memory of change is about telling the story of people fighting back and changing the way we think and changing the dominant worldview.
Thanks, Dawn. So Mahalit, you already kind of touched on this in your case example, but can you share some tangible examples of what any of these interventions might look like in practice? So identifying dominant worldview messages, deconstructing them, imagining alternatives, or rescuing the historical memory of change.
Yeah, so oftentimes when I work with youth, it's understanding movements that have happened before. And these aren't things that are talked about in school, oftentimes for a reason. And, you know, I consider that psychoed. At least that's what I put in my notes. And using that historical memory in order to put that information into action. So like in the example, that could be organizing at work, creating a union, talking to other workers, and even if management's not going to do anything, at least that they can support each other, because community care is a radical act.
Thanks, Mahalit. And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking some clinicians who specialize in other forms of interventions in the room might be wondering, are you able to integrate liberation health models with other therapeutic interventions? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yes, of course. So like I said, it's a tool, and it's important to have multiple tools in your toolkit. As much as I have feelings about CBT, it can be helpful in addressing certain aspects, but still emphasizing that there are larger forces at hand, and CBT isn't being used to have the individual be able to regulate themselves in a toxic environment.
Awesome. Thanks, Mahalit. So that kind of wraps up the bulk of our conversation around the Liberation Health model and framework. But the last question I have prepared for Dawn is, there is an online group that we mentioned earlier with over 2,000 members in it. Can you talk a little bit more about the work of the Boston Liberation Health Group beyond just the framework and model?
Yes, and I would encourage everybody, especially in this era of Zoom, that, you know, anyone that's interested should join our group. All you have to do is answer a few questions to make sure you're not a bot. Is that what it's called? A troll, a bot? I don't know. Something, not a real person. Maybe they're, I don't know. But yeah, anyone, we have members from all over the world. But basically, the Liberation Health Group, which formed 20 years ago, has three functions. One is to provide training and consultation around how to use this model, because as Mahalit said, it's not something that's often taught in schools. I mean, we do teach it where I work at Boston University, but I'd love for us to teach it more, and it's not taught in every school. So we want to have a space where people can go and learn how to use the model. And in every other sort of month, we meet monthly, we actually have somebody that volunteers and comes and presents a situation that they want to talk about. And together we do that triangle that Mahalet just put up. We talk about the personal, cultural, and the institutional factors influencing the problem. And then we break down into small groups to talk about action planning. So that's one thing we do. The second thing we do is we act in the world, right? We're organizers, we're activists. We stand in solidarity with, you know, unions, with, you know, housing justice, racism. We've attended many Black Lives Matter protests. We're just basically part of the activist community, building the new world. You know, our group is explicitly anti-capitalist and looking forward to what we call 21st century socialism. And third thing is we're a support for each other. We're a support group. And back in the day before COVID, we actually met in person. We had, you know, food and wine, and we talked, and, you know, then we would do our meeting. Now we meet online, which we're not able to meet in person, but we do have the opportunity to have people that come from all over the world to our meetings. So it's those three sort of items that we mostly focus on.
Thank you so much, Dawn, and thank you so much both for this wonderful conversation. Next, we do have some time to open it up for a couple questions from our attendees. So if you have a question you would like to ask, please put it in the chat now. If you're on Facebook also, we do have someone monitoring the Facebook chat, so feel free to put your question there and it will be forwarded to me to be able to ask Dawn or Mahalet. So I'll give it a couple minutes to see if anyone in the audience has any questions. One quick question that either of you can answer is, it sounds like someone might have missed, how do they actually join the Boston Liberation Health Group?
Yeah, so we actually have a Facebook page. So if you just type into the search bar Boston Liberation Health, you will find our group. And again, please answer those questions so that we can accept you.
Awesome, thank you. And I see another question here from Anne-Marie. Sadly, the medical model and the dominant discourse tends towards reductionists and limits of the individual. Oops, sorry, I'm mixing up questions here. Okay, here we go, sorry. Mahalet, this question's for you. I think you mentioned you were using this model with young people. How do you adapt and change the language, if you do, to make it translatable and encourage discussion?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. For my high school youth, I will kind of test the waters, and same with parents too, where, you know, they might talk about stressors at work and how they're, you know, trying to balance school and or caretaking, and I'll be like, yeah, that's capitalism for you. And then I kind of see like how they respond and then kind of go from there. There's some people who kind of like, you know, continue talking, and then there's some people who are like, yeah, you're right. I recently had a great conversation with one of my clients who's really into video games, and we tied that into capitalism, how video games intentionally change aspects of the game and don't make them work well so that people buy the next version. And there is a time where we were reflecting about, you know, past year that we've met. And I was like, oh, so what do you feel like you've grown and learned in the past year? And he was like, well, I learned about capitalism and stuff. And I just burst out laughing. And so that's one way of doing it. With younger kids, let's say like 5, 6, 7, I might not do the actual triangle, but I'll talk about different aspects in a way that's developmentally appropriate. So kids who mention that like colorism and saying that, you know, classmates are making fun of them because of their skin color, because they're darker, and naming it as racism. And, you know, that's really important because it models that having these conversations are okay and that they're gaining the vocabulary to name it. And I feel like that was one thing I never learned as a child. I was just like, I'm feeling all these feelings and seeing all these things, but I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know how to label it. And so now I have, you know, my 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds being like, yeah, that was sexism. And I was like, yes, I'm doing a good job.
Thanks, Mahalet. We have a great question in the chat from someone. It feels that a lot of our organizations prioritize brief interventions. Have you found ways to distill the triangle into a single or a few sessions? Maybe just talking about your experience, how long it takes to go through with the triangle?
Yeah, so it really depends how in depth that we go. There are times where we finish it all in a session. There are times where we've had to, we stopped at the cultural factors and then went back to the institutional factors. It really depends. I've only used it in individual sessions, but this definitely could be used in a group setting. It can be used in family therapy, in couples therapy. It really depends on how it's framed and introduced to whoever's partaking in the triangle. I found it really helpful when I did have an office, I put up sticky whiteboard paper, and I always had the triangle there. And oftentimes, especially my little ones, they'll be like, "What's that?" And I'll be like, "Well, since you asked, this is the Liberation Health Triangle." And that was a really good segue, because then they could write on the whiteboard. And it was a way where they could stay engaged. And also, it doesn't have to be words, it could be pictures, where they can draw things like draw a hospital, draw a picture of a kid and another kid, and one being mean to them because of their skin color or because of their gender. So there are lots of different ways to use the Liberation Health Triangle with everyone.
Thanks, Mahali. We have another great question here. How can you manage not others, but your own subtle ways of that colonialism, domination, patriarchy show up in your expert position?
I can take this one. Or having good friends, having some good comrades, having really good community. And I think for me, the Boston Liberation Health Group has been that community. Also, constant reflection. As a overthinker, it's really helpful. And really thinking about, like, why did I think that? And even after we say things, acknowledging, like, oh, I messed up, and being open to feedback from others and changing.
Yeah. And I would add, I think you can always do a triangle on yourself. I've done that lots of times when I think that there might be some factors influencing how I'm seeing the situation. So I'll like do a triangle about the situation and talk, realize, oh my God, sexism is influencing the way I'm thinking about this, or capitalism is impacting my ability to respond this way. So
Yeah, absolutely. I have done the same. We have another great question here. What do you think about calling the people we work with clients, since it has been criticized as reflecting a transactional capitalistic model? This person personally feels uncomfortable using it. What is your position?
I can take that one. Absolutely. I don't like using the word patients, clients at all. I usually say my kids. And my sister jokes and says, one of these days, someone's going to actually think you have children. But some people use the word service users, people who are accessing healthcare. But yeah, that's a very valid critique.
Another question we have, do you encounter opposition to the Liberation Health model from within mainstream mental health institutions and service provider organizations? If so, how do you respond and organize to challenge this?
yeah, so I kind of want to go back to the story I told, how the model got started, because, one of the reasons that I think people were so open to it was because the feedback that we got from so many families in the hospital, the families that had their children on the inpatient psychiatry unit, was they felt judged. They felt people were, criticizing them. They felt defensive, all these sorts of things. And when we went down to the Brazil, and we sort of worked to develop this model in consultation with the families, people were a little bit like, oh, I don't know, like, what is this? Why are we talking about capitalism when somebody comes in with an anger management plan? Like, what, like, shouldn't we just be helping them with their anger, right? And we sort of had to explain to many of the people that we worked with that all of these different factors are related to how people feel, how they think, how they behave. And one of the things I think that was very compelling for our the medical director of our unit, who, as I mentioned, was a white, older man, psychiatrist, trained psychoanalytically, was as soon as we started instituting the model, right, that we had developed, took us about 6 months to develop it, our consumer satisfaction scores went up. So all of a sudden, people were very happy and they felt like they were appreciated and they didn't feel like they were being judged, and they, felt validated, and they felt like they were stopped blaming themselves. So once our consumer satisfaction scores went up, right, the director was like, oh, I guess it's not so bad to talk about these sort of things. But I mean, I don't want to make light of how this model is indeed what Antonio Gramsci would call counter-hegemonic, right? It's not the medical model. It talks about things like capitalism and racism and how they form who we are, right? Ian Ferguson has written quite a bit about this. And so people aren't that happy about that. So we just continue the work. And I think I feel so lucky to be a part of a community, a community of liberation health practitioners. There's 2,000 people in our Facebook group that I know that when I'm in a disagreement with somebody about this, there's 2,000 people out there that kind of think the way I do, and they have my back, and that really helps. And I think knowing that you're not alone with this helps you to sort of keep on doing the work.
Thanks, Dawn. And I think we just have time for one more question. And there are a couple of questions in the chat about adapting the model to a shorter term model or using telehealth, specifically using the telephone. Someone from Greece was asking around that. Do either of you have any thoughts?
Yeah.
So I do all my work on the phone because of COVID for the last year. I've been on the phone and Zoom. So it's totally adaptable to the phone and Zoom. And, you can talk about this stuff, and you can also do it in a short-term way, because once you've identified the dominant worldview messages, you're just kind of threading the needle, bringing it back to what somebody's talking about and the dominant worldview message. What's your experience, Mahalet?
So one concrete way is I will draw out the triangle myself and then take pictures and then text it to them at each step, and specifically like write verbatim of what they're saying. And on Zoom, I will open up, a Word doc or something, or the PDF template that we are going to share, and you just type into the boxes and share your screen.
Thank you so much, Dawn and Mahalet, again, for this presentation and for sharing. It really sounds like this model and framework resonated with folks based off of the chat responses we've been getting. And we're looking forward to staying in touch with all of you today through Facebook and beyond. So if you still have lingering questions, please connect with us on Facebook. And again, I just want to thank the International Social Work Action Network for hosting us today. And before we wrap up our session, we would like to just share a few resources for anyone who's interested in continuing to learn about the Liberation Health model. I'm going to put the links in the chat now and go through each of them. But there should be a link posted in the chat now to our website, a blank Liberation Health triangle template, as well as the first chapter of the Liberation Health book. As well as a link to an article in the Change Agent magazine, which was written by our very own Mahalet, covering the case that was discussed today. So if you want to dive a little bit deeper into the same case that was shortened for the presentation today, please check that out. And finally, I just want to say, please stick around for the next conference session, which is going to be social service workers organizing across the US. To hear more from social service worker organizers from New York City, Boston, Austin, Texas, who are raising working class consciousness at their workplaces and their professions and helping to build a multiracial working class movement in the United States. As y'all know, the movement needs all of us. So please, again, join us at Boston Liberation Health Group on Facebook, and also follow the International Social Work Action Network. Together, we'll win the world we need. Thank you.